Good morning, attendees. Welcome to the first briefing on the first day of Black Hat USA 2024. You're here to see an awesome talk called Tunnel Vision, Exploring VPN Post-Exploitation Techniques, presented by Ori David. So, without further ado, please welcome Ori to the stage.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for the introduction, James. I'm very excited to be here today. And before we get started, I wanted to ask you a question. Do you trust your VPN server? This machine that sits at the edge of your organization and determines who can get in? Well, surely not, right? You know better. You don't trust anyone. You have zero trust. Well, the name of this talk may suggest that we're going to be talking about VPN post-exploitation, which we are also going to be doing. I believe that on a deeper level, today we're going to be talking about relationships, and specifically your relationship with your VPN. I believe that by the end of this talk, you may come to realize that you trust your VPN way more than you thought, and probably way more than you should. So, as you can probably guess by now, our agenda for today is going to be VPN servers. We'll start by discussing VPN exploitation, how and why attackers choose to target these devices. And we'll then go on to the main topic of this talk, VPN post-exploitation, a relatively overlooked aspect of VPN security that I hope to shed a light on today and hopefully raise awareness to. And we will then go on to discuss some principles and best practices that I believe should be followed to minimize the associated risks from the techniques that we will detail today. So a brief introduction. My name is Ori David. I'm a security researcher at Akamai based in Israel. My background is in red teaming and threat hunting, and today I cover a wide variety of research topics in the Akamai security research team. And really, for the last few months of my life, I kind of dedicated myself to VPN security. But even if you haven't been paying too close of an attention to these devices, you likely heard about them recently. So last year has been a pretty rough year for VPN security. It seemed like literally every other month, a critical security vulnerability was discovered in one of the top VPN servers on the market. And these vulnerabilities often led to massive exploitation campaigns affecting thousands of organizations. Now, while this trend saw a significant rise this year, it is certainly not new. Attackers have been targeting these devices for many years. And I believe that the main reason for this would be their very nature. So VPNs are intended to provide access to the internal network from the internet. While this is very useful from an IT perspective, it can also be a pretty interesting opportunity for attackers as well. So couple this with the fact that these devices have not exactly excelled with security over the years, and you get yourself prime targets for exploitation. So as to what attackers actually do after compromising a VPN server, so typically what we see is that attackers abuse VPNs for one main goal, and that is to gain initial access to the network. The attacker will compromise the VPN through a vulnerability, and then will use this access to pivot into the internal network, essentially starting their intrusion from there. Now, while this is obviously very useful and seems to be working for them, I kind of wondered, is that really it? Should we only treat VPN servers as gateways to the network? I wanted to explore the concept of VPN post-exploitation. What can an attacker do on a VPN server after compromising it, in addition to just getting access to the network? To understand this, let's look at a similar example. Let's say that an attacker sends a phishing email to a Windows machine and successfully compromises it. One thing that they may do is simply treat this machine as a gateway to the network. They can tunnel communications through it, begin scanning additional hosts in the network, and again, begin their intrusion from there. Well, in practice, we know that they do much more than that. For example, they will employ a persistency mechanism on the machine to ensure long-term access. They will attempt to gather credentials to access additional resources and move laterally. And really, I can go on here. There are entire frameworks dedicated to Windows post-exploitation. But with VPNs, we don't really talk about these types of techniques that often. I wondered why that's the case, and I think that I have a theory. So I did not invent VPN post-exploitation. Attackers are doing it. They have been doing it for many years. A great recent example came with the Mandiant report released a few months ago about the Ivanti VPN exploitation campaign from last year. And in this report, Mandiant detailed a few very interesting post-exploitation techniques used by the attackers. So, for example, the attacker employed a persistency mechanism on the Ivanti VPN after compromising it. They tampered with log files to evade detection. We have previously seen these types of techniques, similar types of techniques being implemented by attackers. And what's interesting is that in pretty much all cases, these techniques shared a common theme. And that is they were implemented by using an implant. The idea is that attackers, after gaining a remote code execution capability on the VPN, will use it to install a custom implant to run on the device OS itself. At this point, they are free to modify system files, hook functions, and essentially implement anything that they want, any technique that they want. This approach has a significant upside because, as we just said, the attackers can do anything. They have full control over the device functionality, and they can implement any technique that they want. The major downside to this approach is that it is expensive. VPNs are these undocumented black boxes that really don't want you to interact with their insides. So in order to be able to develop and maintain such a tool, an attacker will need to dedicate a lot of time into research and development. Because of this, we typically only see one type of threat actors performing these types of techniques. And that would be your top-tier nation-state threat actors. For your more mid-range APTs and financially motivated threat groups, we don't really see them going through the effort because they simply have simpler things that they can do and seems to be working. Now, because of this, it may seem that this type of risk is simply not that relevant for a lot of organizations. At the end of the day, only a very small subset of organizations are going to be targeted by these top-tier nation states. And for the rest of us, it may seem that there are more urgent things that we should worry about that are more likely to actually affect us. I wanted to try to challenge this assumption. I wanted to try to see if there might be an easier way to perform VPN post-exploitation that might be more accessible to less sophisticated threat actors as well. The approach that I went with is what I call living off the VPN. And it's pretty simple. So instead of going through this very hard route of, that we just described of going deep into the OS and developing this custom implant to implement the techniques that we want, why not instead follow the principle of living off the land and instead abuse existing functionality in the VPN? What I chose to do was to target the management interface of the VPN and see what might be possible to achieve from this interface. So this approach has two main advantages already. First, it is much more easier to perform. So again, instead of writing this custom code on this hardened OS, we are clicking buttons in the UI, which is much easier. And the second thing is that this type of access can actually be easier to obtain. To gain access to the OS to run an implant, you will need a full RC vulnerability. Whereas to access the management interface, you can gain this type of access through an RCE, but also through an authentication bypass vulnerability, or even by compromising credentials. So the idea is that this type of approach can be more accessible to less sophisticated threat actors as well. To test this, I chose to target two of the most popular VPN providers on the market, Ivanti and Fortigate. And again, the idea was, let's assume that we have access to the management interface of these devices, and let's see what we might be able to do from there. we ended up uncovering a set of very interesting techniques that can allow an attacker to gain access to additional critical resources inside the network immediately after compromising the VPN. In some cases, a VPN compromise can very easily become a full network compromise. So I guess let's get to the findings themselves. Starting with abusing remote authentication servers. So let's first understand what that means. In order to access the network through a VPN, a user, a remote client, will need to authenticate to the VPN somehow. The most basic way to do this would be to use a local user. So we create a set of credentials on the VPN. The client can then provide them. The VPN looks them up locally and approves or rejects authentication. Pretty simple stuff. The problem with this approach is that it doesn't really scale well. When we have thousands of users and multiple separate VPN servers, we can run into problems. So what we will actually see being used in most networks are remote authentication servers. Instead of relying on the VPN server to manage the identities themselves, we rely on an existing third-party authentication server, an identity provider. It could be cloud-based or an on-prem identity provider. And now the client provides their normal credentials to the VPN, which then reaches out to the authentication server to validate them, and then approves or rejects the user based on the response. Again, pretty simple stuff. Well, it turns out that if an attacker is at the position of post-exploitation on the VPN, we can actually do some pretty interesting things here. Let's start with abusing LDAP authentication. One very common authentication method is going to be LDAP, in most cases Active Directory. And it is a pretty convenient choice because users can use their normal domain credentials to access the VPN. So let's start with Fortigate and understand how it operates this process. So for Fortigate, exactly as we described, we have this very simple flow here. The user provides their credentials to the VPN validates them, and approves or rejects the user. Now, I want you to try to think, what is the worst possible way this could be implemented? If you guessed that the password is sent in clear text to the LDAP server, congratulations, you are correct. Yeah, so I was shocked when I initially saw this. In order to validate the credentials supplied by the user, what Fortigate does is it performs a simple LDAP bind, which in English means sends the password in clear text to the LDAP server in order to validate them. This is the default behavior. So this is pretty bad, and it actually exposes two sets of credentials. So first, to configure such a server, a remote LDAP authentication server, we will need to specify credentials for the LDAP server for a service account that will be used to query information from the server. So these credentials are sent in clear text. And of course, the credentials that were just entered by the user will also be sent in clear text. Luckily, LDAP-S, LDAP over TLS, is supported, but is not the default option. And in addition to that, in many cases, the LDAP server itself will not support LDAP-S by default. So in a lot of cases, we will see the normal LDAP server being used. OK, moving on to Ivanti. So with Ivanti, we had a slightly different scenario. This time, we have two types of LDAP authentication server. We have a generic LDAP and a dedicated Active Directory server. Let's understand how each of them works. So with the normal LDAP server, we have pretty much the same process we had with Fortigate, where an LDAP bind is performed. But this time, the default setting uses TLS. So if you use simply the default settings, you should be secured from this threat. But again, if LDAP-S is not supported on the remote server and you use normal LDAP, a simple bind is again being performed, and the credential of both the service account on Ivanti and the credentials of the user will be sent in clear text. The second option, an Active Directory authentication server, relies on the fact that we have Active Directory to perform Kerberos authentication. And while Kerberos can be attacked in certain ways, it will at least not send your password in clear text, not that I know of. So it should be the better option. OK, so let's now put on our post-exploitation hat, and let's understand what can we actually do here. So as we just saw, if normal LDAP is used, clear text credentials will be sent from the server. But what if a secure protocol is used, LDAP-S or Kerberos? Well, because we control the VPN, there's nothing stopping us from changing the configuration to normal LDAP. This should be transparent to users. It will not break anything as long as there's no specific firewall policy blocking LDAP to the LDAP server, which I find unlikely. Yeah, and as soon as we do that, clear text credentials begin to flow from the server. The only thing left to answer is how can we actually compromise these credentials? Remember, our scenario here is that we control the management interface. So how can we capture these credentials? Luckily for us, both Fortigate and Ivanti come with a built-in packet capture utility. So what we can do is simply start a packet capture, filter LDAP packets, come back after a few hours to what would be likely a very long list of clear text credentials. So to summarize this section, if an attacker controls your VPN, they will be able to trivially compromise any LDAP credential being sent to it. This should not be news. It makes sense that if an attacker compromises your VPN, they will be able to capture credentials. Going back to the implant scenario where we described previously, an attacker can simply hook the appropriate function and extract a clear text credential. I think that the point here is that they don't have to work that hard. As we just saw, this technique, which is very easy to implement, can allow an attacker to immediately compromise all the LDAP credentials being sent to the VPN. OK, so this was LDAP. But there are other types of remote authentication servers that could be used by VPNs. And I wanted to kind of see if it might be possible to capture additional types of credentials. Well, it is possible. And let's understand how we can do something like this. And to understand it, we'll first describe some details revolving around the usage of multiple authentication servers. So let's start with Fortigate. Fortigate manages authentication using user groups. So the idea is you can create separate groups of users and provide them with different permissions and also different authentication mechanisms. For example, we can have one group of users authenticating using local credentials and a separate group authenticating using a remote LDAP server. An interesting note is that a single user group can have more than one authentication server configured for it. For example, if we have two separate domains and we want to include members from both of them in our group, we can actually do this. So we have two LDAP servers configured in one group. Now, let's say that a user from domain 1 authenticates to Fortigate. What we would expect is that Fortigate will determine the appropriate authentication server and validate the credentials using this server. Well, that's not actually the case. Fortigate will perform authentication against all the configured servers. So even though that the second LDAP server here has no idea who this user even is, they will still receive their credentials. So we'll come back in a minute to this behavior. But first, let's describe something similar that we can do with Ivanti. So with Ivanti, this time we can only have one authentication server per group. We can't have this scenario that we just saw of two separate LDAP servers. But what we can have is what is called a secondary authentication server. This type of server is meant to support certain SSO configurations where more than one server is required to authenticate the user. And when we use this type of server, what happens is that after Ivanti validates the user credentials, we can configure it in such a way that it will also validate the same credentials on the secondary server as well. So how can we actually abuse both of these behaviors? So again, from a post-exploitation point of view, there's nothing stopping us from adding an additional attacker-controlled authentication server to the configuration of Fortigate or Ivanti. This will be either an additional server for Fortigate or a secondary authentication server for Ivanti. Doesn't matter. At the end of the day, the result will be the same. Whenever a user authenticates to the VPN, no matter using what method, any method that is going to be used, the credentials will be validating using the normal authentication server, but they will also, at the background, will be sent to our attacker control server. This very, very simple technique can allow us to capture any credentials sent to the VPN. This will work for local VPN credentials, LDAP credentials, radius authentication, any scenario where a credential is sent to the VPN, an attacker can simply hijack this and capture the credential. OK, so this was remote authentication servers. And we'll now explore another interesting scenario, which is extracting configuration passwords. So VPNs rely on a variety of secrets for the operation that are stored in the device configuration. For example, we have local user passwords, SSH keys, and most interestingly for us today, third-party integration accounts. VPNs can integrate with a variety of services and applications. And to enable these integrations, we will need to specify some sort of credential. This can be a password, an API key, or a certificate. And these secrets will be stored in the device configuration. Now, if we control the VPN, what we can do is we can simply export the device configuration containing these secrets. But it's not that easy, because secrets are stored encrypted. In order to protect them, they will not be stored in clear text, but rather in an encrypted form. Importantly, though, they are not hashed. They are stored using reversible encryption algorithm. So naturally, our next step is going to be decrypting some secrets. We will again start with Fortigate. So for many years, no one really knew how Fortigate secrets were being encrypted. If you looked up online, there was no information. It was kind of a secret. This changed in 2019 when a security researcher named Bart Dofid decided to dig into this process. And what he did was he dumped the code from a Fortigate instance. And after reverse engineering it, he was able to determine that Fortigate encrypts all passwords using a hard-coded key. Now, when I say hard-coded key, I mean one hard-coded key shared across all Fortigate devices in the world. And this key, let me tell you, it's not a good one. Let's just say that it might be the first sentence of a very famous children's poem about a little girl and her little lamb. So yeah, not too good. And because we have a known reversible encryption algorithm with a known key, what this means is that anyone in the world can trivially decrypt these secrets. They are not actually protected in any way. Fortigate acknowledged this risk, and they implemented a fix. What they did was they now allow users to specify a custom encryption key to be used instead of the default one. So this is better, but we still have some problems here. First, the feature is disabled by default. Unless your admin actually goes out and reads the best practices for Fortigate, there's a pretty good chance that this feature will not be used and the same key will still encrypt all the secrets on Fortigate. But even if you have the best admin in the world who actually did this and configured the custom key, you're still not really safe. Because if an attacker controls Fortigate, there's actually a very easy way to bypass this feature. What an attacker can do is they can disable it. This doesn't require knowledge of the secret that was provided previously. An attacker can simply disable the feature. As soon as they do that, encryption of all secrets reverts back to the default key. So what this means is that if an attacker compromises Fortigate, no matter what, it will be trivial for them to extract any secret stored on it. OK, moving on to Ivanti. With Ivanti, we had a similar scenario where we knew that passwords were being saved and encrypted. But this time, there was really no information online about how this encryption was being performed. So having no other choice, I had to dump the code from an Ivanti instance myself and take a look. So after really not that long of an exploration, I encountered this piece of code, which, again, initializes a hard-coded key used to encrypt all secrets on Ivanti. Again, the key is not good. I will not share the full content of it here. But if we take a peek at the beginning of it, Juniper last owned Connect Secure, this VPN that was last obtained by Ivanti, in 2015. So this key was likely not changed in a while. So again, what we have here, we have a known, a reversible encryption algorithm using a known key, which means that it should be trivial to decrypt any password stored on Ivanti. My initial approach was to reverse engineer this process. Ivanti implemented a custom AES-based encryption routine to protect these secrets. Now, after looking at this type of code for a few hours or days, I remembered that I'm not that good of a reverse engineer and that I have better things to do with my life. And I decided to go with a different approach. So remembering that all Ivanti instances use the same encryption key for both encryption and decryption, I decided, why not let Ivanti do the heavy lifting for me? So let's say I was to obtain an encrypted Ivanti secret. What an attacker can do is they can set up in their own environment their own Ivanti instance, controlled by them. At this point, what they can do is they can insert the encrypted password into their own configuration. Specifically, they can insert it as the password of the LDAP service account for Ivanti. Why would I do something as random as that? If you recall from quite a few slides ago, when Ivanti performs LDAP authentication, it will send the service account password in clear text. So if we set our encrypted password as this secret and trigger LDAP authentication, we simply cause Ivanti to decrypt the password for us and send it. At this point, we can simply capture the traffic, and we have the decrypted secret. So this pretty simple solution that I found will work for any secret stored on Ivanti. It is not limited just to LDAP passwords. All secrets are encrypted using exactly the same process. So yeah, this will allow you to access any secret, but this is just kind of a proof of concept. It is surely possible to recreate this in a Python script as well. OK, so our final little finding here for Ivanti revolves around MDM servers. MDM, Mobile Device Management Server, is another type of remote authentication server that can be used by Ivanti. And we'll not go too deep into what these are, but basically they are used to allow mobile devices to authenticate to the VPN. So in order to configure such an authentication server, again, we need a set of credentials for the MDM server. So we configured this type of server, and we took a look at the configuration file. In it, we found two very interesting fields. We have password encrypted and password clear text. Now, do not worry, because the names here are misleading. Both the passwords are stored in clear text. Which means that if you were to compromise an Ivanti server using this type of authentication server, you don't even have to bother decrypting the secrets. It is already there for you twice. OK, so let's summarize configuration passwords. If an attacker compromises your VPN, they will be able to trivially obtain any secret stored on it. I included here a list of possible integrations on Fortigate, for example. We have here things like Kubernetes, ES6i, Active Directory, all the major cloud providers. And what you need to understand is that if you are using any of these integrations, the second an attacker compromises your VPN, they can potentially pivot to these other resources in your network. OK, so let's get to vendor responses, and then we'll summarize. So first of all, some of these findings cannot really be fixed. We disclosed everything that we talked about here to the vendors and additional things that I didn't have time to cover. And they did decide to fix some of them. So let's get to the responses themselves. So Fortigate acknowledged the problem with the LDAP, clear text LDAP authentication. They do not plan to change it. It will still be performed in using a simple LDAP bind. And their suggestion would be simply to not use plain LDAP. I think that the main problem here is that when you configure an LDAP authentication server, I bet you don't consider that your password will be sending clear text. So Fortinet will update their documentation to strongly discourage this type of authentication server. And the second thing, Fortinet initially considered the custom key bypass that I detailed here as a vulnerability. but eventually decided that it doesn't cross a security boundary and will not fix it. So what this means is that, again, as we just saw, it will be trivial and it is not going to be fixed. Anyone who compromises Fortigate can very easily extract any secrets stored on it. As for Ivanti, Ivanti plans to fix two of the problems that we highlighted here in an upcoming patch scheduled for October. So first, the static encryption key that is used to encrypt all secrets on Ivanti, they plan to fix it. I don't have any additional details about what they intend to do, but they plan to fix it. And MDM passwords should no longer be saved in clear text. OK, so before we finish, I wanted to emphasize something. The techniques that I've detailed here are not like something in theory. Attackers are already using them. Going back again to the Mandiant report that I previously mentioned, in this report, it is detailed how attackers were able to move laterally to Active Directory after compromising Ivanti by extracting the LDAP service account configured on Ivanti. Now, the report doesn't share exactly how the attackers were able to do this, but as we just saw here, we have two very trivial ways to do this, either by decrypting the Ivanti configuration file or by sniffing packets and extracting the password from there. So I think that my point here is that attackers are already using this type of techniques, and I think it is only a matter of time before less sophisticated threat actors catch up. OK, so let's talk a bit about detection and mitigation. What can and should we do about these types of risks? First, I want to say, today we focused on Fortinet and Ivanti, but I believe that variations of what we just saw, we're going to be seeing similar things in other products as well. So it is relevant for you if you use a VPN, I believe. Let's start with detection. I would say that the best advantage that we as defenders have here is that VPNs tend to be relatively static, especially when compared to something like an endpoint. VPNs don't change that often, and any change should stick out. So we have pretty basic things here. Collect and analyze logs. These devices, in many cases, have pretty detailed logs for a lot of events that occur on them, and you should collect and analyze them in an attempt to identify anomalies, which, again, should stick out. Another thing that I would recommend would be to keep an eye on your configuration files. A lot of the attacks that I detailed here and in general will result in changes to the device configuration. Again, VPN configuration likely doesn't change on a daily basis. So if you periodically pull these files and compare them to a golden image, for example, you can potentially identify anomalies. As for mitigation, which I think is even more critical here. So the first thing that I would recommend is to limit service account permissions. As we just saw here, if you configure a service account on your VPN, it will be trivial for an attacker to compromise it. Even if it's not trivial, it will be possible. There's no way around this. If the credentials are there, an attacker will be able to get them. So understand this and limit service account permissions as much as possible. Understand that if an attacker compromises your VPN, they can potentially immediately compromise additional resources if you use too strong of permissions. The second one, which I believe is going to be harder but is critical, and that is to use dedicated identities for VPN authentication. If you use the same identities to authenticate to your VPN and to all other resources in your network, what happens is that you create a central point of failure exposed to the internet, which runs on software that tends to be vulnerable from time to time. Because as we just saw, if an attacker compromises the VPN, it will be trivial for them to compromise any identity used to authenticate to this VPN. If you use the same identities, a VPN compromise can become an entire network compromise. To mitigate this, I would recommend to use separate identities meant specifically for VPN authentication. And finally, I would recommend following the principles of zero trust network access. Do not provide excessive network access either to your users or to your VPN server itself. I believe in most cases, there's probably no reason to provide the VPN server itself with excessive network access. They are usually a very small amount of applications that are going to be used through the VPN. So limit the network permissions of the server and the users to limit potential blast radius from these breaches. OK, so to wrap things up, a few points. Threat actors are coming for your VPN. This may sound a bit dramatic, but I do believe that's the case. We are seeing them time after time targeting these devices to great results for them. So it is important to understand that your VPN might be targeted one day. You need to understand that a compromised VPN can provide much more than network access. As we just saw here, there are many other things that an attacker can achieve after compromising your VPN. And finally, going back to the question which opened this talk, do not trust your VPN. Assume that an attacker will breach or already have breached it, and try to act accordingly in order to minimize the risks from this type of breach. Before I finish, I just wanted to say that there are additional details and techniques that I didn't have time to cover, which we will publish to Akamai's blog today, which you can check out here. If you have any questions, I will be at the wrap room after the talk. And that's it. Thank you very much.